This week on Operation F&B.
This doesn't really get better until trust is reinstated. That will be a big challenge for restaurateurs to try to figure out how to message that.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to Operation F&B. My name's Justin Green. I'm your host, and I really appreciate you joining me today. First things first, for those of you that are getting back on the saddle, getting out there and opening, I hope you're doing so safely. I hope that you're healthy. Reach out to me. Let me know what you're seeing. I'm curious. I want to talk about it, and I want to make sure that everyone in the industry and those outside of it that are curious know what you're seeing and going through. This week, we're going to jump right into our interview. It's awesome. I have Adam Reiner, who is a industry veteran, creator of Restaurant Manifesto. If you haven't seen that, you're going to want to by the end of this interview. He does a great job talking to people about what it's like being inside the industry, and he also has an interesting take on teaching people how to be better guests inside of our restaurants. Here we go. All right, Adam, thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a pleasure.
So you are based out of New York City, which has been obviously hit exponentially hard by the pandemic. How have you been dealing with all that?
Well, it's been a good time to kind of stand back and look at the world and start thinking about, what it might be like to re-enter service. But for me personally, it's been nice to just kind of focus on things that I want to do, housing projects and listening to vinyl records and also working on my website, which has been a really big, it's been a big push for me in the time away from restaurants because there's so much going on, so much to talk about. And so for the writing, there's a lot of fertile ground here.
Your website is awesome. I think the take is awesome. It's the Restaurant Manifesto. You go in a completely different angle than what most people do. Everything that, most do are how to teach people how to be better at what they're doing, right? How do you teach a server to be better? How do you teach a chef to be better? How do you teach a manager to be better? And you come at it from the look of how can I teach the guests to understand the industry better, to be better guests?
Well, that was always the original conceit of the website. So my idea was always that because I've been a server most of my career, you're at a table and you're dealing with somebody and they do something that is just mind-blowingly, inept. And you really wish you could just pull them aside and be like, I know what you're wanting here. And this would be a better strategy on how you can get it. So I've always wanted to sort of write from a compassionate place where it's not like the bitchy waiter, style, where it's more constructive and kind of let's break down, what just happened and let me, try to shed light on the language that you use to engage servers, which I think is something that is really kind of an art form. I always feel like when I dine out that I'm good at it, but it's not looked as a skill, not like cooking. Cooking is you spend years of your life training and you get better and you cook. You can move on in your career as a chef, but no one ever thinks about dining as a skill. And I think it really is. I think dining out well is something you can work at, you can think about, and you can improve upon.
So you have been a server your entire life?
More or less, some of the roles that I've had, I've been referred to as a captain, which is like a fancy way of saying waiter, but I've also spent some time overseas. And I think that you have too. I had a job as a brand ambassador in Hong Kong where my job was a little bit more as like a training captain, where I was sort of like a representative of a New York restaurant where I was working with the staff to try to help them with their swagger.
Do you find that when you go overseas, and I know that I found it pretty regularly, especially in the Caribbean, that people don't have a grip on what hospitality really is, or what service really is, because they didn't grow up with that, or they didn't have that in their lives?
There's certainly cultural differences in Hong Kong that I think for me were rooted more in how much respect is given to the people who work in these roles, because culturally, I think it's looked down upon. If you have a son or daughter that works in a restaurant, that's considered disgraceful. But in the United States, I think we've gotten to a point where a restaurant, job or working in hospitality has become something that's very honorable, and even that's changed in the last 15 years. That's a new thing. Which is one of the things that really concerns me about where we're at today, especially for front of house people who have dedicated so much of their life to making a career of this. This is a huge threat. But if you look at a place like Hong Kong, where you don't have many jobs that are desirable for people, and the salaries are not higher, you're getting a different caliber of person that's working in those jobs, and many of them are they work hard and they try hard and they whatever, but they're very poorly paid, and it doesn't bring people from more educated circles or into the fray. Where in New York especially, you have I've worked with people who have PhDs, who are lawyers. There's some that go into their corporate jobs that they make less money, and they come back to the restaurant after that because they enjoy it more and they can make money. So right now, I think if you look at where we're at going forward, aside from the fact that there are going to be just plain less jobs out there, there's also going to be, I think, it's going to be difficult to reinstate some of the salary levels for front of house, particularly when it comes to tips. And I know that that's a controversial topic, and I don't like to get too deep into that, but that's part of it.
Listen, I think there are two things that you just said that I think are really interesting. One is, what do you think is going to happen with our industry? Do you think that the owners, the operators, the managers are going to take advantage of the fact that there's suddenly a huge amount of people available to work, that in the last few years, obviously, there's been this drought, and you could, as a server or a cook, you could jump jobs in a second and know that, what, I'm leaving today, you treated me badly, I'll have another job by the end of the day. That's not going to be the case now. There's going to be more people than jobs. Do you think that salaries and pay stay the same? Do you think they drop? Do you think that we see a change in respect for the industry and maybe it goes up? What do you think that's going to land?
Well, the first part of what you said, I think my initial reaction is going to be a little cynical, because I do think that there are going to be a lot of restaurateurs who use this as an excuse to squeeze, the people that are working for them. So some of the perks that may have been offered for some of these jobs may start to disappear, because they'll tell you that they don't have the budget for it, et cetera. I do think, though, that management, it will be interesting to see how management handles the aftermath of this, because I think that there's going to be sort of a traumatic shock kind of feeling among a lot of people who are going back into the industry, just imagining what that first day is going to be like. I think that managers are going to have to deal with some of the kind of psychological elements of just being completely paralyzed for months. That's just not something that restaurant people deal with. That when this first went down, the hardest part for me was missing the adrenaline of service. Like you are accustomed to showing up at work, and you're kind of like, it's like doing a workout. You feel kind of drained and you're tired or whatever. But then the minute you go over to your first table and you have all these things that you have to deal with, and you're, talking to the chef and you're putting in 5 orders and all that stuff, it's like, you start to get aerobic, and there's a feeling, a thrill and an adrenaline of restaurant work that for people who are not working and sitting at home, like for the first couple of weeks, there was a real kind of depressive funk that settled in for me, which was like, oh man, like it's not just about not being able to go outside. It's also knowing that your work life is so much about that adrenaline rush, followed by the going to bars with your friends afterwards and sort of letting out all of that stuff. So without it, it's been really, really hard. But it's a complicated question. I think that's one that's going to be constantly evolving. It is not going to be, every restaurant is not going to be the same. Even the way that restaurateurs right now are dealing with this in a different way. Some, have laid off their staff and let them go. Some have tried to create programs where they're like, supporting them in one way or the other. So I think it's very, very hard to generalize about how this is going to evolve.
You talked about the psychology of what it's going to be like to return for everyone in the industry. What can be done in the restaurants that would make you as a server, make your colleagues around you feel safer and feel more comfortable coming to work, knowing that we're living in the age that we're living?
That's a really hard question. And I wrote an article about this recently, just about how the restaurant has always been an oasis from, getting away from the world. And so the idea of being masked and with gloves and, in this sort of like clinical style of serving is sort of antithetical to everything that we do. Servers especially are the ones who are designed at the table to try to, charm you as much as possible. So it's almost impossible to imagine what that's going to be like without having all of our capabilities. So, I don't know. I think that a lot of restaurant people are, very cavalier about all of this stuff. And I don't expect that many of my colleagues anyway are going to be all worried about, protective things. But I will expect that the restaurant owners will be. They're going to be the ones who are directing these policies for their own good and for their customers' own good. But for the servers themselves, I think our first priority is going to be, how do we earn a living again? But it does, I think, depend a lot on what's happening. Like, are there people on staff who have gotten sick? Are there people that you've heard about that have dined in the restaurant that have gotten sick? But one thing's for sure, nothing is ever going to be the same in the next, year or so in restaurants. So I think that everybody's going to have to sort of let go of whatever happened in the past and stop trying to get back to where we were, and start to think about hospitality in a totally different way. And it's scary to do that. And
that's what your new article is about, your most recent one that you wrote, which is Hospitality Will Have to Change in the Aftermath of COVID-19. And tell me, obviously, what drove you to put this on paper. And I think some of the points that you made in the article are really interesting. Talk to me about why you wrote this.
Sure. Well, the beginning of the article is just sort of talking about how waitstaff have not been displaced by automated things. Like the restaurant is kind of become the ultimate analog experience. And the reason that they have lasted for so many years and have continued to thrive even more so, I think, is because you have this human connection in this community. It's really more than, I think, what we make it of all this foodie Instagram stuff that's happening all the time. Do you really think that when people go back to restaurants right now that they're going to be taking photographs of their food and posting it on their Instagram? No, they're going to be ecstatic to have company and to have human connection and all of that. So I think, what I wanted to sort of focus on is the fact that you have this human element that is so important, that has never been replaced by technology. And now you have created an environment where it's going to be so difficult for people who serve you to be able to take care of you the way that they want to do it. Like, we work so hard in restaurants to build a culture around hospitality, and how do you take care of people, and how do you turn guests around, and all of these things. And, to put us in an environment that's so clinical like that, where you're wearing a mask or you're wearing gloves or you can't give specials or whatever, it's going to make it really, really hard for us to find new ways of making people feel like we're paying attention to them, when our presence at the table is actually something that might be looked at as a negative thing. One thing that I've been thinking about that kind of relates to this point, and I wanted to make it, is that when I think about how restaurants are born, like, you had a line cook that was on your show, who was great, and a young cook. You think about these young, professionals in the restaurant world, and they're working at all these different places, and they're learning all these different cuisines. They learn French technique. They learn how to make Asian style food, whatever. And all the time they're thinking, as they're working those jobs, they're thinking, I want to have my own restaurant one day. And when I have my own restaurant, it's going to be, Mexican street food meets, Thai, something elevated, So for those type of chefs and restaurateurs, it's a multi-year process where you finally get to that point where you have investors, or you find raise your own capital, and you open that restaurant because of that singular idea. Now to have to pivot to something completely different, where you're selling, pantry items or cocktails in a plastic cup, it's really, really hard, I think, to ask those people who have put so much of their life and passion and ideas, and they've been thinking about it for so long, and ask them to completely change their business model, which is why I think still a lot of people in the restaurant world are just like stunned, and they can't move. And some of them just straight up don't want to have to re-enter the business with something that they don't feel has integrity.
I think that's something that I'm seeing a lot as I'm reading, as I'm going on to different places to see where people in the industry are really just being honest and laying it all out there. One is they're afraid to return because they're not sure that the people that they work for are going to take the steps necessary to keep them safe, or it's just not been communicated well to them. Or the other piece is they don't know that they want to stay in the industry. They're afraid that it was so easy to shut the hospitality industry down. We were the first industry to completely close up. We're probably going to be one of the last to really open up fully. And they're scared. They see the industry now as fallible. And I don't know right now a good way to sit in front of somebody and say, you know what, I've got all the answers for you, and I think if we just stay down this road, we can fix that. I don't have those answers right now, and I think that having some of these conversations will help that, but we don't want the industry to go away. I mean, it's still an incredible industry. I think we still have a lot of, we have a lot that we can do to continue to flourish, but we've got to get through this piece, and I'm not sure how to keep people just from exiting the industry as a whole right now and trusting that we're doing the right things.
Well, the first thing is going to be trust. I think building trust, that's going to be, I think, a huge push for people, that run businesses like yours. How do you convey to your clientele that your establishment is a place where you can comfortably be taken care of under with the backdrop of COVID-19? That is not going to be the same as the way that we took care of people before. So that this doesn't really get better until trust is reinstated. And so I think that will be a big challenge for restaurateurs to try to figure out how to message that. But as far as a bounce back in the industry, there will be, I think, once things reopen, there will be a lot of people who are just, ecstatic to be able to go out again, and they'll do it regardless of what the rules are, but will they do it recklessly? And how do we police that? I make a comment in my article about talking about how dress codes were often hard to enforce. If somebody walks in, I work in a fine dining restaurant. If somebody walks in with shorts, if somebody walks in with sandals, if somebody walks in with a cap on, there was a time where somebody would pull them aside politely and say, I'm sorry, but would you please remove that, or we'll need you to change into something else, whatever it is. But that's something that through the years has become harder and harder for people to even have that conversation. It's so hard to have that conversation with people because you don't want to set the tone where you offend them. So now imagine that you have somebody who doesn't want to wear a mask, in the dining room, and that's a policy. What's that conversation going to look like? How is that, guest going to accept it? Which is another point too about how, and I think it ties everything into my website and the reasons that I want people to understand better how to dine. What is the role of the guest? What is the expectation going to be for people who are dining out now at the table? One thing I saw some restaurant was talking about, because they're only able to sit limited capacity, they were talking about putting a time constraint on the reservation. So in other words, you only have an hour and a half, you're welcomed for an hour and a half. And that to me was something where I was so excited to hear that, because people always treat their restaurant table like it's something that belongs to them until they decide it doesn't. And that's not really fair, to an industry that has already struggled so much. Even before the pandemic, it was already struggling to find economics that would work, where it could be profitable to the point where the business can thrive. So it's going to put a lot of onus on the guests too. This is not going to be just something that we deal with on our own. We're going to have to get some participation for the people that are dining with us.
It's funny. So in one of our locations, obviously we have a very large sports bar, and we talked about initially, do you put some sort of time constraints on the tables? Because you will have people that sit there all day and want to watch everything. And what we found was it was really difficult to do in that specific situation, because say you're right in the middle of watching a game and your time's up and somebody else is ready to sit. How do you build that in? So we really went away from it and started looking at doing minimums at tables. And that was a way that we addressed that. Look, if you're going to be here for all of this time, we're going to talk about doing minimums at the tables, and that's how we kind of went in a little bit of a different direction to kind of solve for that.
Guests in restaurants generally don't like rules. I can't tell you how many times that I've dealt with people at the table where you're like, I'm sorry, the chef isn't, we're not able to make that change to the dish. We're not able to take that vegetable and magically, make it appear as a side dish. And people get really, rigid in those moments, where the attitude is always like, you can't tell me that, I'm paying for this. Like, this is my prerogative. If, I'll take my business elsewhere. And I think when restaurants reopen, you will probably see a rather dramatic change in the way that restaurants approach the rules and standing behind them with guests in a way that is that there is less wavering. And I think I welcome those things. I'm that might be even a reason for me to want to come back sooner, like not vindictively, but it's like, I've always felt if you want to have a great restaurant experience, this is by far the most basic thing that I write about. If you want to have a great restaurant experience, it requires your participation. You cannot be passive when you dine out. Anyone that thinks that a great restaurant experience is you're sitting, laying back, and have everybody feed you grapes, that is not a great restaurant experience. The great restaurant experience is where you lean back and they feed you grapes, but you also interact with them and you have fun with them and you get to know them and you take their recommendations and you try new things. Those are the special moments, not the ones where you're not involved.
How do you convert some of those things that you're talking about and adapt them in this new way? You talked about there having to be some sort of reimagining of what hospitality is when we return because of the virus. How do you, who has all of these ideas and has done this for a long time and very, in all kinds of different ways, what do you think we can do to be imaginative as we return?
It will be very hard, I think, service-wise, because again, so much of what the push will be is to try to minimize the exposure that guests have with staff. I don't think that a staff's presence at the table is going to be something that is looked on as a positive thing. So, that will be hard to predict because I don't know what that's going to look like. But I will tell you that I expect there to be a lot of innovation from the kitchen side of things. Like, for example, this is just an example. It's been table side presentations have been very popular lately. There might be a dish where in the past, the way it was served was that the dish is placed in front of you and then your captain or somebody comes over and they finish the dish with a sauce. I think that the kitchen is going to have to reconfigure a lot of those dishes in a way that makes the guest finish those things, but in a way that's fun, in a way that's fun, in a way that, you take someone can come over and instruct you how to do it yourself in a cheeky and humorous way that may make them feel like they're getting a little bit of that sort of tableside, theater that they weren't getting, but that they're doing it themselves.
Maybe that helps with that interaction that you were talking about. It helps make sure that maybe that's a positive thing in the end. They're automatically more involved because they're having to actually do something on their meal. That's interesting.
Yeah. And also, like, from a hospitality standpoint, if people are coming in with that more sort of primal need to commune and to share experiences with their guests and even just to be nourished, maybe that is really what we're kind of striving to, instead of trying to inspire people with this experience of food and service. Maybe what it is we're really just trying to give people comfort and making them feel at home, despite the fact that we have all of these kind of, obstacles like masks and gloves.
Clearly you have an unbelievable knowledge of the industry. What has stopped you from becoming a manager? Have you been a manager before? You decided to continue to serve?
Well, if you talk to most New York hospitality professionals, they will tell you that management is very difficult compared to working in a server job, because your hours are longer, your pay is often less. So that is really kind of for the people who are passionate about wanting to become a general manager, for example. Just work your way from floor manager position to becoming a general manager. My strengths have always been, I think, at the table, to talk to people and to get them excited about food and beverages and drinks. And I like the social element of it. Another article that I wrote has to do with my early job. One of the first jobs I had in New York was an office job, and it was a cubicle that was just miserable, and it only went on for less than a year. But after that, I took a job that I looked at as temporary, waiting tables. I had a job in Times Square working at a theme restaurant that was about comedy, and it was ridiculous. Like, we would pop out of the windows and tell jokes and whatever. It was a terrible restaurant. The food was awful, but we had free reign to wear costumes and to play characters and to be fun and different. And the people that I met were incredible. And that has always kind of kept me going. But I always feel like I need to have that sort of social element at the table, and that it doesn't really get me excited to have to do more administrative things. And also really to have to babysit, a whole staff of people. Managing in a restaurant is a lot about dealing with egos and trying to keep people getting along. And I just don't think that those things play to my strengths. And what I love about being in a restaurant is being on the floor and being in touch with people and seeing what gets them fired up and trying to have that personal connection. I
think we always talk about being a high school principal for the rest of your life when you get into restaurant management. And that's what we talk about, because it really, you bring up a good point. You're dealing with all of these different personalities. You're dealing with people of so many different ages and different maturity levels and different parts of their lives, and people that you end up being a part-time psychologist as well with all of those things. So interesting that you see that. Does it make you act differently towards your managers, knowing and seeing those things?
No, I think that but one of the skills that managers really do need to have, and the best ones are the ones that understand the tendencies of all their staff. We were talking a little bit about basketball before we got on, and I think that Phil Jackson, I'm a Chicago Bulls fan. Phil Jackson, and I've been watching this Last Dance documentary, which is so good. He's such a great example of somebody as a coach who is able to get the most out of all of these different players and understand their roles. The way that he handles Dennis Rodman and some of his quirky things, but still understands that he's great in his own way, and some of the ways I think that where he knew when to kind of stay out of Michael's way and let Michael be Michael, or the way that that he was able to try to get everybody to buy into whatever system they were working with, which was more about the team and not about individual achievement. That is the job of a manager. Whereas really what I want to do is I want to be a player. I want to be out there, shooting hoops. I like being on the court. Which, I hate to take this analogy that much further, but sitting on the sidelines right now is really, really hard for people. There's a lot of people who are like, even those who hated their jobs are like, let's get this going. Let's play. I think there's definitely people getting anxious in the restaurant world to want to get back to work. It's not just about money. It's also about seeing their friends. Our friends in the restaurant world are our family. I've had many Zoom conversations with groups of people among my staff. You can almost feel that people that didn't even get along with each other before are cordial with each other. It's hard to be away from our families. They're like our surrogate families.
Yeah, you don't have to get along with everybody in your family.
We go through so much hell together, though. We go through so much hell together. Hard services, busy nights, breaking records for covers. Like you're going to step on each other's toes, but at the end of the day, those bonds that you form with people that you work with in restaurants are so strong. I have friends in New York that I have known for, almost 20 years, that are people that were there with me when I started working in restaurants. And they are some of the best friends that I have. And I'm so fortunate to have met them through the restaurant world. I wouldn't have envisioned in a million years that I would still be working in a restaurant. Not in a million years.
Certainly not the direction I thought my life was going to take me into hospitality. But it's interesting that you say that, because I really think that there are not a lot of industries that the people that you work with, you get so close with and you know so much about. And I think that part of it is the hours that we work, the amount of time that we're around each other. I also think that hospitality is such a personal thing that we end up sharing and talking about things that maybe you wouldn't in other industries.
Even like family meals, when you sit down with each other and you have that staff meal before the shift, that becomes, a place for you to talk about your life and what's going on, who you're dating or who you broke up with, or, in some cases, like for me, even with my writing, like the grassroots of how my website got started and really caught on was through my peers. And saying like, hey, I wrote this article that I think is really kind of, will speak to what we're dealing with here. And a lot of my friends at work are the people who are the best proponents of that work and helping it get out there.
Your website has become a voice, obviously, for a lot of people to be able to say what they want to say. Love the website for that. Has it been cathartic for you? Because your articles throughout COVID and throughout, obviously, the pandemic seem to be changing depending on what's going on. Your last one, you wrote about having or possibly retiring or thinking about retiring. Is it really following what you're feeling at different times? And what caused you to write that? You seem to love the industry.
Well, first of all, like if you look back into the archives a little bit, and there are some really fun articles that are centered around stories that actually happened to me in service. So just fundamentally for the website, not having that daily exposure to a dining room full of people where I have to deal and interact with people, where something happens, where a light bulb comes on above my head about, oh, this would be something that would be really great to write about. Like my most popular article from a traffic standpoint is this article I wrote about people ordering steaks medium rare plus, which
I read that article.
Is infuriating. It's infuriating to servers, but it's something that people that don't work in restaurants cannot understand. And, rather than belabor this and go on to explain what all of that is, the point is that that it was in direct result, from things that were happening to me at work. And it was just something that kept popping up on my radar. And I was like, okay, I have to write about this. So now that there is an absence completely of that connection to the restaurant and daily, service, now I have to start kind of thinking about it from a different bird's eye view. And so maybe things are becoming a little bit more philosophical and more kind of like, based around my ideas about what restaurants are supposed to be and what hospitality is supposed to be. But in terms of that article about maybe retiring from restaurants, that is a very real feeling. Like that is something that sooner or later I'm going to have to, just like a lot of people in the restaurants, they're going to have to face that phone call from their general manager who says, we're putting the band back together. And, most people, especially ones that have worked in places that were formerly very busy and that were lucrative jobs, these are not going to be the same jobs. They're not going to pay as well because there won't be as many people dining there anymore. If you're a tipped employee, the future is very, very cloudy. So, near term, it's going to require a lot of soul searching for people. Like, is this something that I want to endure? Do I want to deal with what it's going to feel like to be in a mask in a dining room? Is that going to be fun? And some of us who have worked, I worked for the company that was currently employed by for about 5 years. So if you put that much time into a job and into building your reputation in that job, it's really, really hard to walk away from it. But I think in the same token, this could be, maybe a time for people like me to start thinking about, well, is this something that I still want to do? And is this something that I will still get joy from in the same way?
Some that I've talked to have said, look, I've been in this industry my entire life. And because of that, I may not have the education that I need to go into something else, or I may not have an education that is relevant anymore because I went to school, 15 years ago for what I went to school for. Have you talked to people that's a real concern for them and they feel trapped?
When you're reconnecting with people, from your restaurant world, like those aren't the things that you're talking about yet. Because a lot of us don't want to have to face that inevitable music. And I'm one of them. I'm very scared about what it's going to be like, but I guess I'm somebody that feels like I can be resourceful enough to figure out some other path, whether it be building my website, my audience for my website, and my writing. That's, that could be one way. But I think that there are also maybe even some other ancillary things about being good at hospitality, where there will be opportunities that present themselves. Once the dust settles, you're going to see a lot of entrepreneurship. There's going to be a lot of people who see this as an opportunity to jump into a rental space that was vacated, but now is, 30% less. You're going to see somebody who, was working as an executive chef and now they're going to have a food truck because they don't want to go back to being, working in a place where they don't know whether they're going to be employed for 8 weeks or 8 months. So I think that there will be opportunity once this is all over. But anybody that wants to think about what they're going back to cannot be thinking about what they're going back to as exactly what it was, because it won't be. And so from my perspective, being a guy that has worked in a lot of front of house positions where you're surviving on tips, how do you make money when there's not people sitting in the dining room? If you have limits on the capacity, okay, fine. You cut the wait staff on the floor, but what happens to all those other half of the wait staff that's not working? Those people are just going to sit at home and wait for the call from the bullpen. No, it's not going to happen like that. So I think that there's going to be a lot of people that are, especially in front of house, who leave the talent pool. They decide to move on to different things. But it's, it may not necessarily be in hospitality. I've had a lot of people who have worked as servers or as sommeliers who they've just gotten tired of the day-to-day of service. And they've gone on to do things like sell wine, be a wine rep, or, consult with restaurants to help them set up systems, or working for POS companies that sell to restaurants because they have that insight. Regardless, we don't know what the restaurant business is going to look like in 6 months. So who knows what kind of jobs are going to be there or not be there. But I would suggest for most people, and this is the way I've, handled it, is to use this opportunity as a time to, check in with yourself and figure out where you are, what you need, whether you think you can endure that hard period of time where it's really going to feel like the world is over, because there will be a light at the end of the tunnel. There always is. And restaurant people are the most resilient I think, strongest people on the planet. We have such high tolerance and such a high threshold for pain, evidenced, by the way that people oftentimes treat us badly, and we smile and we take it and we find a way to take the high road. This is going to be a real test, and well, some people will be up to it and some people won't.
I talked to somebody recently that talked about that, how the tipping culture in food and beverage has led to people just taking abuse, and that they've found there's actually a study that's been done that shows that sexual harassment is exceptionally high and taken in the industry because of saying, look, I have to take it. It's just words. That's what they're telling themselves while people are saying it. And you've dealt with it. You've been beat up. People have said things to you. And it's because you know that you've got this tip at the end that if you don't get that, you've got nothing.
I wrote an article that it's another one kind of in the archives, and I it's one of my favorite pieces, that is about, should a waiter ever question a tip? And it talks about a scenario that happened to me where there was a group of business guys and they wanted to play the credit card roulette game where, you mix up the cards and whoever picks whoever card is picked is the one that's going to pay. And I was their waiter, and they asked me if I could bring the hostess, who is this young, cute blonde woman, to come over there to help them play this game. And I was like, that's not really what I do. I'm more the food and beverage guy. So I refused, and I went back to the table, like, you guys ready to pay? And they brought it up again, and they gave me a really hard time about it. And I talked to her about it, and I was like, listen, these guys, and they're like, oh, I know. She said, I know. One of the guys came over to me and asked me whatever. So they were like making this big thing. So I said no. And it was like a big check. It was like $800 check, split 4 ways, 4 cards. All 4 guys left me zero. Wow. And yeah. And I went out, I followed them out on the street, and I was like, I'm sorry to approach you, but I just wanted to know, like, is the reason that you gave me no tip because I wouldn't, play this credit card game with you? And the guy was like, yeah, actually it was. And I said, I'm sorry, I take a lot of pride in what I do. And when you do something like that, I take it really personally. I think that's offensive, and then just wish them good night.
Well, no response, no response from them.
Well, I mean, it was a bunch of these business guys puffing their chests out and whatever. But the point is that, I mean, in terms of the abuse that we take, we rarely have the voice to, and I'm not sure that this is necessarily just a tipping thing. We rarely have a voice to be able to confront people and say, you know what you're doing is wrong. You shouldn't be treating me like that. You don't have a right to treat me like that. And different management staffs will intervene in different ways. Some are hands off and some will step in. The managers will always tell you to have them handle it instead of having you handle it. But why shouldn't you handle it? If you are the one that they're making the statement to, why should they not have to face you? Because the manager is going to be the one that's saying, like, was everything okay with service tonight, sir? That's not really confronting them. So yeah, I mean, I think, yes, it's a problem with tipping culture, but it's also a problem of serving someone and their attitudes about what it means to have you as their server. What
culturally do you think created the ability for people to just treat people in the service industry that way? I don't want to say that it's everyone, but it's pretty rampant. I mean, you see it often. These are not stories that happen every once in a while. People really act as though the people in the service industry are inferior in so many ways. And it doesn't matter almost what level you're in. You can be the GM of a really beautiful, well-known restaurant. You could be an executive in the industry. You could be a server, you could be a bartender, whatever it may be. I think that there's something still about the service industry that some people feel it's okay to treat people that way. What do you think is culturally caused that?
I'm not sure that it's necessarily a cultural thing as much as it is. Well, I guess, it probably goes way, way back, further than any of us do, in terms of roles of servitude. But just talking about it on our modern level, the problem is that there are so rarely any consequences of misbehavior. Every single restaurant that I've worked at, and probably every single person that's listening to this that works in a restaurant can say the same thing, has that one or two guests that they can't stand, that nobody can stand, that they, every time they come in, they act the same way and they drive everybody crazy and they send back their food and whatever, like just constant. And yet they're welcomed back time and again. We don't really show people the door. In the entire time that I've worked in restaurants, I can probably count on one hand the times that people have been asked to leave. And, you know, it's hard to think back on what the thresholds were, but the thresholds were really high, you know, like something like grabbing a member of the staff, you know. But I think a majority of the misbehavior that we're talking about is mental abuse. It isn't physical abuse, it's mental abuse. And it's very hard to stop that without being able to say, like, you can't treat me like this. That's why that story about questioning the tip, that was just something that I've never done before. And, you know, it might've been triumphant in the moment for me, but it didn't do anything. It didn't do anything good for me. I didn't get more money. And it didn't do anything for them because they're still going to be jerks. And, you know, I have to come back and tell my manager that I did that and then face the fact that, you know, he or she thinks that I should have told them first. So there's really not anything that ever good that's going to come out of restaurant staff confronting a guest. There's just not.
It's interesting, though. I think part of what is really neat about your website, you have something called Table Talk that's on there. That's kind of teaching guests what the inside terms are or what a server says to you and what the actual meaning behind that is. I think if people would pay attention to what you're talking about and learn some of these things, they might be able to better understand the industry itself. They may have a better experience. Really interesting that you do that. Is that something that you continue to add on to as things happen and you say, oh, I need to make sure that that's one thing I want to tell people about?
The original articles on the site were called Dining Tips, and they were little blurbs that specifically were about, here's a way that you can think about doing this and asking for this in a way that's more productive. And that's how I launched the site. And then as time progressed, it kind of became a little bit more about essays and the articles became a little bit more long form. And, you know, I kind of went away from that format of these little short blips. I don't know why, but I think I just started to think about these things in a different way where I wanted to be more about a story and I wanted to be more about a journey where you're like listening to a story and then you learn a lesson from it. The language stuff, though, is very important. I just haven't written a lot of articles recently about that, but those pieces I think are still very salient. It's like, I've always used the example that making specifications about your water at the beginning of your meal is a terrible idea. Like there's always people who are like, you know, you offer water, would you like bottled or tap? Can I have water with some ice and lemon on the side? It's like, all right, fine. You want ice and lemon on the side. That's totally, I get it. You want ice and lemon on the side. But for that being the first thing that you ask for, you have to understand that you are now setting the tone with the person serving you, that you are that type of person that is going to be high maintenance, even if you're not. So just accept your water, talk about the menu, and then say nicely, would you mind bringing me some ice and lemon for the water? This is a huge difference. It's a huge difference. And the fact is that you're having ice and lemon for the moment you sit down is really not that important. You can survive without it. But what is important is the relationship that you have with the server who's taking care of you, and protecting that and nurturing that will result in better service. So it is worth it. It is worth it. And people oftentimes just say like, well, who cares if I want ice and lemon in my water? What's the big deal? That's why I go to restaurants. Fine. If that's your attitude, that's fine. But it comes with consequences, and those are the consequences. And if you don't understand them, you're going to end up getting, you know, you caught in some of these pitfalls. And that's the kinds of things that I want to talk about. And there are ways of saying that. Another example that I've used is to say to somebody, and this is like, it's taking it a little far, but saying to someone like, I think you waited on me last time that I was here, even if it's a lie. Waiters so rarely get any recognition from people that it really kind of disarms you a little bit. I hate to sound like I'm being, making this into a manipulative thing, but an easier way to do it is to say, we're really excited to be here. The waiter gives you the menus and you say, we're really excited to dine here. It is just impossible for even the most disgruntled server to not hear that response and say, this is a table of people that I want to take care of. It's huge. It's huge.
And it's two things, right? One is that you're helping that server realize, hey, this table is going to be great. And a lot of times it's easier to not make mistakes when you're calmer around a table, right? I would tell people that all the time. Take a minute, calm down, and you're going to make less mistakes because you're not trying to do everything so rigidly. And when you feel a little more comfortable around people, you're not as rigid. So it does help. But I think on the other side of that too, while you're giving the server that calm, that server then is going to reciprocate, right? The service is probably going to be the best that you've had. They're going to be a little more honest about the items on the menu that you really should try and that they really like. You're giving them that ability to be honest with you, and your experience is going to be better.
The opposite of what happens, though, and keep this in mind, is that you have two couples, for example, that haven't seen each other for a long time, and they're in conversation, and they haven't thought about what kind of cocktails we're going to have or all of these things. And the waiter comes over and says hello and gives a warm greeting, and crickets, nothing, no, can't stop your conversation and acknowledge the person. Okay. I get it. You're having a conversation. You're involved in what's going on. But if you don't acknowledge the person that's coming over to say hello to you, again, you're setting this tone that's like, we're not really concerned about how you're going to be involved in our meal tonight. And that, even if it's not true, you have to understand that that's not the kind of tone that you want to set with the person serving you. So, stop your conversation. Sorry, we're kind of in the middle of the conversation, but, hi, or like, we're excited to be here. Give us a second and we'll choose some drinks. Like, it's just so important. But the flip side is that for the people that just ignore that greeting, they're okay. Now you're setting the attitude on a decline. Whereas, those little subtle things are so potent in terms of like the quality of your service. And it's something that we always blame on the waiter. It's like, well, the waiter shouldn't have made that assumption. It's like, okay, fine. They shouldn't have made that assumption, but those things still happen. And the relationship is a two-way street, and you have to be more involved and accept your responsibility in what it is to build that. I feel so strongly about that. And I feel like when I dine out, I try to be at least somewhat cognizant of those things. And it's not just like because I work in the restaurant world. It's because I see so often the mistakes that people make, and I can learn from them. I want them to be able to learn from my perspective.
If there was one thing that, if you left the industry today, if there was one thing that you would be proud to have taught guests that are coming into restaurants, what would that one thing be?
For people to build a sense of respect about how much goes into making a restaurant experience special. There's just so much ignorance about how staffs need to work in concert to make all of these things happen for you, which is why, like, when people ask for, like, for example, somebody wants a steak and it's shared between two people and they want you to cook it to two different temperatures. Can you just cut the steak in half and do one of it medium well and one of it rare? It's like, yeah, that sounds really super easy if you were doing it at home for yourself. But when you have a kitchen that the guy behind the grill has 50 steaks going on at the same time, he doesn't have time to cut all 50 of them in half and cook them to two separate temperatures. So, it's really, I think, the greatest thing that could come from my writing and from my website is for people to have these aha moments about, oh yeah, I never thought about what that would be like. There's an article on my site it's called "It's All About the Flow," and it's talking about kitchen lines and how they work, and why if you order an entree without an appetizer, which we call an order fire, that might be something that's going to take way, way longer. And the reason is because there are already tickets in the kitchen of tables that have been served appetizers and are waiting for their main courses. And if you only order main courses, it's coming from that part of the kitchen that is making the main courses for the people that are waiting, that have already had their appetizers. So you can't just put in your order before those people get their entrees. Otherwise, they end up waiting an extra 5 or 10 minutes, which is critical. So those are things that if you don't work in the restaurant business, you don't know what an order fire is. All you know is that the waiter keeps pestering you about ordering an appetizer, and it feels like they're trying to push you into spending more. But it's actually they're trying to persuade you to have a flow of your meal that is, you're not going to feel like you're waiting 30 minutes for your entrees. These are realities on the ground that we talk about and we face and we train about, and we try so hard to convey these things to people at tables. And there's a lot of skepticism that results from it. And it's not like, I can't teach people at a table. Okay. But I definitely think that if people somehow find my articles in their, social media links, who love restaurants, it might cause them to think differently. And that would be I think the one thing that I would really, really would make me happy to have people have their eyes open to some of these like insider things.
Well, if you want to be a better guest at a restaurant, if you want to enjoy restaurants better, you have to check out restaurantmanifesto.com. And of course, follow him on social at RestoFesto. Adam, I really appreciate all of your time today. Unbelievably insightful. And I look forward to talking to you again really soon.
Thank you. Congrats on the podcast. It's awesome.
Thanks so much. Well, that brings us to the end of episode number 3. Thank you so much for joining me. Next week's guest is Katie Osuna, who's the co-creator of the James Beard award-winning podcast, Copper and Heat. You will not want to miss that conversation. She has insight into the industry, what it's like to be a female in the industry, especially in the kitchen. I'm really excited to talk to her. If you have any great ideas or want to talk to me about the show, reach out at operationfnb.com and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast service to Operation F&B. Talk to you soon.
This message will self-destruct in 5 seconds.